Hey friends, today I want to talk about indirect objects. We are in Henle 1, page 22, towards the bottom of the page. This is part 3 of, I believe, lesson 2. Lesson 2, part 3, the indirect object. So let's talk about this. First, we want to remember what we know about indirect objects. If you think back to essentials, and if you weren't in essentials, don't worry about it. You'll learn something new. If you think back to essentials and you think about your 7-sentence patterns, you will find that in the 7-sentence patterns, the indirect object occurs only in one of those patterns. If you sing the song, you get to SVTIODO. SVTIODO. What does that stand for? It stands for subject, verb, indirect object, direct object. What that means is that anytime we have an indirect object in a sentence, we also have a direct object. And in English, we tend to put the indirect object first. What does that look like? Our example sentence in our book is Christ gave God glory. Christ gave God glory. So first, before we can identify our indirect object, it's normally helpful to identify our direct object. This is important. Write this down in your notes for this section. You'll never have an indirect object without a direct object. And I'm going to explain to you why. We find the direct object first because the direct object receives the action of the verb. And then the indirect object answers the question to whom or for whom that direct object is done or said or given. I'll show you. So Christ gave God glory. Christ gave God glory. In this sentence, we have Christ being the subject and gave being the verb. Now, to find our direct object, we ask the question, what did Christ give? Did Christ give God, or did Christ give glory? Christ gave God glory. So it's the glory that he's giving. Christ gave glory. That's the direct object. That's a noun. It's something you can give. Okay, so Christ gave God glory. There's our direct object. And then the question we ask for the indirect object is to whom or for whom the direct object is given. So, to whom did Christ give glory? Christ gave God glory, okay? God is our indirect object. We can also translate this Latin sentence, Christus gloriam Deo dedit, as Christ gave glory to God. In English, either one of these is appropriate. In English, sometimes you have the question for this second one, is to God, is God an object of the preposition to there? For our Latin purposes, anytime you're giving something to someone, or you're showing something someone, or you're throwing a ball to someone, the to whom or for whom the direct object is given or sung or thrown, that's your indirect object. So in Latin, Christ gave glory to God. God's the indirect object, and you wouldn't translate to. And in the top sentence, Christ gave God glory. God is your indirect object. But this is a good way to see that our sentence pattern, SVTIODO, it shows that the IO, the indirect object, can come before the direct object. That's a common thing that happens in English. We can say Christ gave God glory. She threw me the ball. She threw me the ball. She gave me the mail. She sung us a song. The indirect objects, me, us, those come before the direct objects in English. However, when we are writing things like this, we can also write it this way. But then it's to God. She gave the mail to me. She sung a song to us. Then it's going to be after to, and then it's really easy to identify the indirect object, because the question we want to ask to identify the indirect object is to whom or for whom. So if it says to God, to us, to my sister, for my dog, those are all indirect objects in Latin. Okay? So I wanted to talk about that. So in order to have an indirect object, you must have a direct object, because you've got to have a thing to give a person. All right? Our direct objects that we know so far are going to end with, where's my board? Look at this. Our direct objects are in the accusative case. So far, our direct objects are going to end with or os, os, or ah. Okay? These are our direct object endings. So you got to have one of those in order to have an indirect object. And we'll learn about those endings shortly. Follow with me on page 22, number 3, the indirect object. Christus gloriam Deo dedit. Christ gave glory to God, or Christ gave God glory. We want to make sure gloriam is the direct object, and it has our ending, so that's a direct object ending. It says, in these sentences, to God and God are indirect objects. Glory is the direct object. The indirect object expresses the person, less frequently the thing. It expresses the person to or for whom something is said, told, given, entrusted, etc. Here's our rule. The indirect object is put in the dative case. The indirect object is put in the dative case. Let's sing our Latin noun cases song. Here we go. Nominative, subject, genitive, possessive, dative, indirect object, accusative, direct object, ablative, object of the preposition, Latin noun cases. I'm excited to learn all about indirect objects. Yes? Indirect object is put in the dative case, okay? So we're going to add a line. The dative case, we're adding a line to the things that we understand now, okay? Look at page 23, how to diagram sentences containing an indirect object. I'm not going to talk about diagramming, but feel free to reach out. There it is right there in front of you. We have some new vocab. Dedit, he, she, it gave. Dederunt, they gave. All right, notice your he, she, it ends with a T. Your they ends with an NT. Okay, so T is still singular, NT is still plural. We're still going to use this in order to identify if our subject is going to be a singular subject or a plural subject. So pay attention to this. Notice also here that we have something in the past tense. Now we have a way to say, instead of he, she, it praises, or he or they pray, we have gave. Okay, this is a past tense verb. And we have a new noun, gladius, gladii, sword. It's where we get our word gladiator. Gladiator. Okay, this is the first time we're getting a new noun, and it's not blatantly obvious what declension it belongs to. So what you have to do when you write this down is you have to find it. Look at your genitive singular. We have I, E or E. Okay? Gladius, gladii. All right? So it's second declension. You see that? Gladius, gladii. And we see that it's not neuter, it's not gladium, it's gladius. Gladius, gladii. It's second declension masculine. Make a note in your notes. You're going to need to know that. And then we have our first conjunction, said, or second. I think we've learned et, and now we're learning said, but. But this, or not that, but this, for example. Okay? Related English words, we have the gladiator fought bravely for gladius. Dedit, I kind of think of like a dedication. If they gave me something great, or they gave a special honor, they like dedicated it. Dedit, dederunt, he gave or they gave. So now's a great time. Add to your note cards for your vocabulary. Jot down that gladius, gladii is a second declension masculine noun. Maybe start a new spot for conjunctions. Make those note cards, and flip through your vocabulary if you have not done that in a while. Our next video is going to be on exercise 19, which we'll practice using this new dative case that we're just learning how to use. All right, see you then.